I was invited to Mount Weather, a secret government base, for a meeting I couldn't refuse. Inside, I encountered soldiers frozen in time, blank-eyed and robotic, and a chilling officer who accused me of abandoning my men during a failed mission. As I wandered the endless halls, haunted by whispers and shadows of those I left behind, I realized Mount Weather wasn't just a place, it was a limbo for guilt and regret. Though I tried to escape, I never truly left. The base had claimed me forever. It all started with a letter. A plain white envelope arrived in my mailbox on a gray January morning, with no return address and my name typed neatly across the front, Colonel David Harper, retired. I almost tossed it in the junk pile, assuming it was some kind of spam, but something about the precision of the lettering caught my attention. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the kind you'd find in a government office, stiff, off-white, and completely devoid of personality. The text was short and to the point, the kind of thing I'd seen 100 times during my years in the service. Colonel Harper, you are invited to a classified briefing at Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center. Attendance is mandatory. Transportation will be provided. There was no signature, just a time, 9 a.m., 2 days from now, and a note at the bottom, bring no personal devices. Mandatory. That word lingered in my mind, bringing back memories of orders barked in sterile rooms, of missions no one wanted to take but everyone had to. I'd been out of the military for years, living a quiet life in suburban Virginia, but something about the letter stirred an old sense of duty I couldn't quite shake. Mount Weather. I'd heard the name in whispers over the years. A doomsday bunker buried deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, one of those places that only existed in conspiracy theories and classified files. Officially, it was a continuity of government facility, but no one seemed to know exactly what went on there. And now, for some reason, they wanted me there. I almost didn't go. Almost. But curiosity got the better of me, and on the appointed day, I found myself waiting on the curb outside my house as a black SUV pulled up. The driver didn't speak, just nodded as I climbed in and shut the door behind me. The drive was uneventful, the mountains rising around us as we left the city behind. Snow blanketed the ground, and the sky was the kind of flat gray that made the world feel smaller. The SUV wound through narrow mountain roads until we reached a gated checkpoint, guarded by men in dark uniforms. They didn't speak either, just waved us through after a brief inspection. When we arrived at Mount Weather, I was struck by how unassuming it looked from the outside. Just a few low-slung buildings surrounded by a chain-link fence, the kind of place you'd drive past without a second thought. But as I stepped out of the SUV, I felt the weight of the place, an invisible pressure that settled over me like a shroud. A young soldier met me at the entrance, his uniform immaculate but oddly outdated, like something out of the 1980s. His face was blank, his eyes glassy, and he spoke in clipped, mechanical tones. "Follow me." He led me through a series of checkpoints and down a long hallway lined with steel doors. The deeper we went, the colder it became, the fluorescent lights flickering faintly above. I tried to make small talk, but he didn't respond, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Finally, we reached an elevator. The soldier swiped a keycard and pressed a button marked Sublevel 5. The door slid shut, and the elevator began its descent. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of machinery. I glanced at the soldier, but he didn't move, didn't blink. When the doors opened, I stepped into a long corridor lined with concrete walls and flickering lights. The air was colder here, damp and heavy, and my breath puffed out in faint clouds. The soldier gestured for me to follow, and I complied, my unease growing with every step. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the emptiness. I passed doors labeled with strange symbols and phrases I didn't understand, Vault D, Containment 3, Observation Room Alpha. Each one was locked, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from behind them. Finally, we reached a large steel door at the end of the hallway. The soldier swiped his card again, and the door hissed open to reveal a conference room. It was a stark, sterile space, with a long table in the center and rows of chairs on either side. The walls were lined with old maps and faded photographs, and a faint hum of static filled the air. And then I saw them. The room was filled with soldiers, but something was wrong. Their uniforms were immaculate but didn't match. Some wore fatigues from World War II, others from Vietnam, and a few from more recent conflicts. They sat perfectly still, their hands folded neatly on the table, their faces expressionless. Their eyes were the worst part. Empty and glassy, like mannequins. "Take a seat," the soldier behind me said. I hesitated, my stomach churning. "Who are they?" "They're waiting for the briefing to begin," he replied, his tone flat. Against my better judgment, I sat at the table, the chair cold and unyielding beneath me. The other soldiers didn't react, didn't even glance in my direction. They just stared straight ahead, their blank eyes fixed on the far wall. A man entered the room, his footsteps sharp against the concrete floor. He wore an officer's uniform, pristine and pressed, but his face was gaunt, his skin pale and waxy. He carried a clipboard and began to read in a monotone voice. "Operation Morningstar. Deployment parameters, classified. Objectives, classified. Casualty estimates, classified." The words washed over me, meaningless and hollow. The soldiers responded in unison, their voices flat and robotic. "Acknowledged." I tried to speak, to ask what the hell was going on, but my throat felt tight, my voice caught in my chest. I looked around the room, searching for any sign of life, but there was nothing, just rows of empty faces, staring into nothing. And then, for the first time, the officer looked at me. His eyes were wrong, too bright, too sharp, as if they could see straight through me. "Colonel Harper," he said, his voice echoing in the silence. "You've returned." "Returned?" I managed to choke out. "I've never been here before." His lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "Haven't you?" Before I could respond, the lights flickered, and the air grew colder. The soldiers turned their heads in perfect unison, their empty eyes locking onto me. I felt a chill run down my spine, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, a shadow, flickering at the edges of the room. The officer stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Welcome to Mount Weather, Colonel. You've been expected." And then the room went dark. When the lights flickered back on, the room seemed different. The sterile, concrete walls had taken on a faint, almost imperceptible sheen, as though they were slick with moisture. The hum of static that had been a faint background noise now droned louder, buzzing in my ears. The soldiers, if that's what they were, remained seated, their blank eyes fixed on me. The officer, his pale face unnervingly close, smiled that same cold, humorless smile. "Let us begin." "Begin what?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What is this place?" He ignored me, turning back to the table. His voice was calm, almost soothing in its monotony. "Operation Morningstar will commence at 0900. You have all been selected for your exemplary service and dedication to the cause." The soldiers responded in unison, their voices flat and mechanical, "Acknowledged." Something about their synchronized reply sent a chill down my spine. Their voices overlapped perfectly, like a single entity speaking through many mouths. The sound seemed to hang in the air, unnatural and wrong. I pushed back my chair, the screech of metal on concrete cutting through the droning hum. "This is insane." "What are you talking about?" "These people," I gestured at the soldiers, my hand shaking, "they're not alive." The officer turned to me, his expression unchanging. "Alive or not, they serve." Before I could process his words, the lights flickered again. This time, the flicker stretched into a full blackout, plunging the room into darkness. I froze, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The hum of static grew louder, almost deafening, and in the darkness, I heard something else. A voice. Faint, distorted, and echoing. "Harper," it whispered, the sound dragging out my name like it was being pulled through a tunnel. "Do you remember?" I whipped around, trying to pinpoint the source of the voice, but the darkness was impenetrable. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the cold, damp air press against me like a heavy blanket. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" The static surged, and the voice came again, louder this time. "You left us." The lights snapped back on, and I stumbled backward, nearly falling. The soldiers were no longer seated. They stood in perfect rows, their blank eyes locked on me, their faces pale and expressionless. The officer remained at the head of the table, watching me with unsettling calm. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded, my voice breaking. The officer took a step closer, his movements unnervingly smooth. "You were chosen, Colonel Harper. Your service is required." "For what?" I shouted. "This isn't real. You're not real." He tilted his head slightly, as though considering my words. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and metallic. He held it out to me. It was my dog tags. I stared at them, my stomach churning. They were mine, my name, my service number, etched into the metal. But they were old, tarnished, as though they'd been buried for years. "How?" My voice faltered. "How do you have these?" "You left us," the voice whispered again, though this time it wasn't coming from the officer. It was coming from the soldiers. Their mouths didn't move, but the words filled the room, overlapping and echoing like a broken record. "You left us," they repeated. "You left us behind." I stumbled back, the cold air clawing at my skin. Memories I had buried long ago began to surface, faces of soldiers I had served with, missions that had gone wrong, and the gut-wrenching guilt of knowing I couldn't save everyone. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't real. This is some kind of trick." The officer stepped closer, his glassy eyes boring into mine. "It's not a trick, Colonel. It's the truth. Mount Weather is a place for those who cannot move on. Those whose service never truly ends." I felt the walls closing in, the cold pressing harder against me. "What are you saying? That this place is, what? Some kind of purgatory?" His lips curled into that same unsettling smile. "Something like that." The soldiers began to move, their steps synchronized, their empty eyes never leaving me. They formed a circle around me, their voices rising in a chilling chant. "You left us. You left us. You left us." My head throbbed, the noise unbearable. "Stop it!" I shouted, covering my ears. "Stop!" The officer raised his hand, and the chanting ceased instantly. The silence that followed was worse, heavy and suffocating. He leaned in close, his cold breath brushing against my face. "You have a choice, Colonel Harper. Stay and serve, or leave, and carry us with you forever." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, searching for a way out, for an explanation, for anything that made sense. "Why me?" I whispered. "Why bring me here?" The officer straightened, his face unreadable. "Because you were part of this. Whether you remember or not." The lights flickered again, and in the brief flashes of darkness, I saw them, faces I recognized, soldiers I had served with. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths twisted in silent screams. They reached for me, their fingers cold and claw-like. When the light steadied, they were gone, but their absence was almost worse. I turned to the officer, desperation clawing at my chest. "I'm not staying here." His smile widened, and for the first time, his voice softened, almost kind. "You already are." Before I could respond, the lights went out completely, and the room dissolved into cold, endless darkness. When the darkness receded, I found myself alone. The conference room was gone, replaced by a narrow, dimly lit hallway. The walls were concrete, cold to the touch, and damp with condensation. Overhead, the faint flicker of fluorescent lights cast long, shifting shadows. The air smelled of mildew and metal, sharp and suffocating. I turned in slow circles, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing down the corridor. Nothing. I didn't know how I'd ended up here. One moment, the soldiers had surrounded me, their hollow eyes accusing. The next, I was here, as if the building itself had swallowed me whole. I tried to steady my breathing, to tamp down the rising panic. "Get a grip, Harper. Find an exit." I picked a direction and started walking. The hallway stretched on endlessly, every corner a mirror of the last. Doors lined the walls, their surfaces unmarked and solid, but none of the handles turned. I tried each one, my frustration growing with every step. As I moved deeper into the labyrinth, faint noises began to echo through the halls. Whispers, distant and unintelligible, like wind funneling through a cavern. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, growing louder the farther I walked. The whispers weren't the only sounds. Occasionally, I heard faint footsteps, the soft tap, tap, tap of boots on concrete, always just around the next corner. Every time I turned to confront them, the hallway was empty. It was as though the walls themselves were alive, mocking me with every step. I came to a fork in the corridor, two identical paths stretching into the unknown. My flashlight flickered as I stood there, sweat slicking my palms despite the cold. Something caught my eye to the left, a faint glint of light at the edge of my vision. I hesitated, then followed it. The corridor opened into a room, its walls lined with filing cabinets and old maps. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a dim, flickering glow. In the center of the room stood a table, and on it lay a series of documents, their edges yellowed with age. Cautiously, I approached the table. The documents looked official: military orders, troop deployments, maps marked with red circles. My name appeared at the top of one page, the text beneath detailing missions I hadn't thought about in years. Missions that had gone wrong. My stomach churned as I read the last line: Casualty Report, 14 Kia. The names below were familiar, each one a soldier I'd served with, soldiers I'd lost. You left us. The voice was faint, barely audible, but it made my skin crawl. I spun around, but the room was empty. The shadows seemed to ripple, and for a moment I thought I saw faces, distorted and hollow, forming in the concrete walls. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing. No answer, but the shadows continued to move. I backed toward the door, my heart pounding. The moment I stepped into the hallway, the whispers surged, louder now, overlapping in a cacophony of accusations. "You left us. You left us. You left us." The lights flickered wildly, and I broke into a run, the sounds chasing me down the corridor. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned corner after corner, desperate to find a way out. The air grew colder with every step, frost forming on the walls and the edges of my jacket. Finally, I stumbled into another room, this one larger, with high ceilings and walls lined with rusted lockers. A mirror hung on the far wall, cracked and clouded with age. I moved toward it, drawn by some inexplicable compulsion. When I reached the mirror, I froze. The reflection staring back at me wasn't my own. The man in the mirror wore a uniform I hadn't seen in decades, his face younger, his eyes wide with terror. Blood spattered his chest, seeping from a wound that didn't seem to stop. His lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear. Behind him, shadows twisted and writhed, their shapes almost human but wrong, their faces pale and empty. The figure in the mirror raised a hand, pointing directly at me. His voice came then, faint and distorted, as though carried across a great distance. "You shouldn't have left." The mirror shattered, shards of glass raining to the floor. The shadows in the reflection spilled into the room, their movements jerky and unnatural. I stumbled back, my pulse thundering in my ears. The figures stepped closer, their hollow eyes locked on mine. "Stay," they whispered, their voices blending into a single, chilling note. "Stay with us." I bolted, sprinting out of the room and back into the endless hallways. The air was freezing now, my breath visible in short, desperate bursts. The walls seemed to close in, the corridors twisting and looping until I no longer knew where I was. Then I heard it, footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from behind me. I glanced back and saw them, rows of soldiers, their faces blank and their movements synchronized, marching toward me with unrelenting precision. "Stay," they whispered in unison. "You can't leave." I ran faster, my lungs burning as the cold cut into me. The hallways blurred, the lights flickering wildly, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping until they were all I could hear. And then I hit a dead end. The corridor ended in a massive steel door, its surface cold and unyielding. I slammed my fists against it, desperate, but it didn't budge. Behind me, the whispers stopped, replaced by silence so heavy it pressed against my chest. I turned slowly, my back against the door. The soldiers were there, standing in perfect rows, their empty eyes fixed on me. At the front of the group stood the officer, his pale face twisted into a chilling smile. "You're home, Colonel Harper," he said, his voice echoing in the cold, lifeless air. "And you'll never leave again." I stood frozen against the steel door, the chilling presence of the officer and his ghostly soldiers bearing down on me. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in short, visible puffs, each one a fleeting reminder that I was still alive. For now. The officer stepped forward, his movements smooth and deliberate. The soldiers remained behind him, their blank eyes fixed on me, unblinking, unrelenting. "You were chosen for this," the officer said, his voice calm yet laced with an edge of authority that cut through the suffocating silence. "You always knew you'd come back here." "I don't even know what this is," I spat, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound defiant. "You keep saying I was chosen, but I didn't sign up for this. Whatever this is, it's not real." "Oh, it's very real, Colonel Harper," he replied, his thin lips curling into a faint, cold smile. "Real in ways you cannot yet understand. But you will. Soon enough." The steel door at my back felt like ice, sapping the heat from my body. I clenched my fists, trying to focus, to find some way out of this nightmare. "What do you want from me?" I demanded. "Why bring me here?" The officer tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You were part of something bigger than yourself. Something that didn't end just because you walked away." "I didn't walk away," I shouted, the anger bubbling up from the pit of my stomach. "I followed orders. I did everything I was told to do. And if things went wrong, it wasn't my fault." The officer's smile faded. "You left them." The air grew colder, and the soldiers stepped forward in unison, their movements precise and mechanical. My back pressed harder against the door as I tried to retreat further, but there was nowhere left to go. "You left them to die," the officer continued, his voice soft yet cutting, each word a dagger to my chest. "They followed your orders, believed in you, trusted you. And when the time came, you left them behind." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "That's not true. I couldn't save them." "You didn't try to save them," the officer countered, his tone icy. "You followed orders. You saved yourself." The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, creeping closer as the soldiers' hollow eyes bore into me. I could hear the faint whispers again, overlapping and growing louder with every passing second. "You left us," they chanted, their voices blending into a single, haunting drone. "You left us." My hands clenched into fists, my nails digging into my palms. "I didn't have a choice," I shouted. "There was nothing I could do." "You don't understand." "We understand," the officer interrupted, his tone calm and deliberate. "We understand all too well. Because now, you're one of us." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so thick it felt like it would crush me. The officer raised a hand, and the soldiers parted, creating a narrow path down the corridor. "Come," he said, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. "There's something you need to see." I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to run, to fight, to do anything but follow him. But my feet moved on their own, as if drawn by an invisible force. I followed him down the corridor, the soldiers' blank faces watching me as I passed. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the flickering lights casting distorted shadows on the walls. The whispers returned, faint and distant, as if coming from the walls themselves. They spoke of missions, regrets, and sacrifices, their words disjointed and fragmented. Finally, we reached another steel door. The officer pressed his hand against it, and it slid open with a low hiss, revealing a massive, dimly lit chamber. The room was filled with rows of desks and monitors, each one manned by a figure in a military uniform. The screens flickered with images of soldiers in the field, their faces twisted in fear and pain. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and something metallic, like blood. "This is where it all began," the officer said, gesturing to the room. "This is where the decisions were made, where lives were weighed and discarded like pawns on a chessboard." I stared at the screens, my stomach churning. The images felt familiar, too familiar. I saw soldiers huddled in trenches, their faces streaked with mud and blood. I saw explosions ripping through the air, the ground littered with bodies. And then I saw myself. It was a younger version of me, barking orders into a radio as chaos erupted around me. The memory hit me like a punch to the gut, Operation Ironclad, a mission that had gone horribly wrong. We'd been ambushed, pinned down, and outnumbered. I'd called in an airstrike, knowing it would wipe out the enemy, and my own men. No, I whispered, my knees buckling. This isn't real. It's as real as it needs to be, the officer said, his voice cold and detached. Every decision you made, every life you ended, is etched into this place. You cannot escape it. The shadows in the room began to move, coalescing into shapes, figures that I recognized. They were the men I had served with, the ones who hadn't made it back. Their faces were pale and lifeless, their eyes hollow, their mouths twisted into silent screams. You left us, they whispered, their voices blending into a chilling chorus. You left us. I fell to my knees, the weight of their accusations crushing me. I didn't mean to, I choked out. I thought I was doing the right thing. The officer knelt beside me, his glassy eyes locking onto mine. And now, you have the chance to make it right. The shadows surged forward, enveloping me in darkness. The cold was unbearable, seeping into my bones, freezing me from the inside out. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the void. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I found myself back in the hallway, alone. The steel door was gone, replaced by another endless corridor. The whispers were faint now, barely audible, but I could still feel their presence, lingering just out of sight. I took a shaky step forward, my legs trembling. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing, I couldn't stay here. Not if I wanted to hold on to what was left of my sanity. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how far I went, I was only getting deeper into the nightmare. I walked through the endless corridor, my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The whispers had faded to faint murmurs, but their presence lingered, wrapping around me like a shroud. Every step felt heavier, as if the air itself had grown dense, pressing down on me with unseen hands. I didn't know how long I'd been walking. Time didn't seem to matter in this place, if it even existed at all. The walls, the floor, the flickering lights above, all seemed to blend together into an endless, cold limbo. And yet, I kept moving, driven by some primal instinct to survive, even as the rational part of my mind screamed that there was no escape. The corridor finally ended in a massive steel door, its surface rusted and pitted, as if it had been abandoned for centuries. Above it, etched into the concrete, were the words, Command Center. The door loomed before me, silent and impenetrable. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the corroded handle. My pulse thudded in my ears, my breath fogging the cold air. There was no going back. Whatever lay beyond this door was the heart of the nightmare, the place where it had all begun. With a deep breath, I pulled the handle. The door groaned open, revealing a cavernous room bathed in dim, flickering light. The air was thick and cold, heavy with the metallic tang of ozone. Rows of consoles and monitors filled the space, their screens flickering with distorted images of soldiers in the field, battle maps, and static-filled video feeds. At the center of the room stood a massive table, its surface carved with maps and markers. Surrounding it were figures in military uniforms, their backs to me. They were frozen, unmoving, as if they'd been waiting for centuries. The faint hum of machinery filled the silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of static. Welcome, Colonel Harper. The voice was smooth, cold, and unmistakable. I turned to see the officer standing at the far end of the room, his pale face illuminated by the flickering monitors. His eyes were sharper now, brighter, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. I see you found your way to the command center, he said, his tone almost conversational. This is where the decisions are made, where history is written. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my voice steady. What is this place? What do you want from me? This place, he said, gesturing around the room, is Mount Weather. It is more than just a bunker, more than just a facility. It is a nexus, a convergence of time, memory, and consequence. It exists beyond the boundaries of what you understand as reality. And what about them? I asked, nodding toward the frozen figures around the table. Who are they? He smiled faintly. They are the decision makers, the strategists, the ones who played their part in shaping the world. And like you, they are here because they have nowhere else to go. I took a step closer, my anger boiling beneath the surface. I didn't ask to be here. You dragged me into this. No, he said, his tone softening. You brought yourself here. Your actions, your choices, they tethered you to this place long before you received the invitation. I didn't have a choice, I snapped. I followed orders. I did what I had to do. And now, you must face the consequences, he said. His voice grew colder, sharper. Every decision has a cost, Colonel. Every life you took, every soldier you left behind, they're all here, waiting for you. As he spoke, the figures around the table began to move. Slowly, unnaturally, they turned to face me. Their faces were pale and hollow, their eyes empty voids that seemed to pierce straight through me. One by one, they stepped forward, their movements stiff and mechanical. You left us, one of them said, his voice a low, guttural whisper. You gave the order, another said, her tone filled with quiet accusation. You abandoned us, a third added, his voice trembling with rage. The words hit me like blows, each one dredging up memories I had fought to bury. The faces of soldiers I had served with, men and women who had trusted me, who had followed my commands into the jaws of death, filled my mind. I saw their final moments, fear, pain, betrayal, played out in vivid, excruciating detail. I didn't mean to, I stammered, my voice breaking. I didn't want to. You didn't try to save us, one of them said, stepping closer. His face was gaunt and frostbitten, his eyes pools of black. You saved yourself. No, I whispered, shaking my head. That's not true. You didn't care, another said, her face twisted into a mask of sorrow. You left us to die. I had no choice. I shouted, my voice echoing in the cavernous room. I followed orders. I did what I thought was right. And now you will follow orders again, the officer said, his voice cutting through the din, but this time, you will stay. You will serve. You will bear the weight of your choices for eternity. The figures closed in around me, their hollow eyes unblinking, their whispers blending into a deafening roar. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, coiling around me like serpents, their cold touch freezing me to the core. No! I screamed, thrashing against the invisible grip. I won't stay here. You can't keep me here. You cannot escape, the officer said, his glowing eyes locking onto mine. Mount Weather is not a place you leave. It is a place that claims you. Forever. The shadows enveloped me, pulling me into the darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were all I could hear. My vision blurred, my body growing numb as the cold consumed me. And then, silence. I woke up in my car, parked at the edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The sun was rising, casting the snow-covered peaks in hues of gold and pink. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, a vivid, horrifying nightmare. But as I looked in the rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. The reflection staring back at me wasn't my own. It was the officer's pale, hollow face, his glowing eyes filled with quiet menace. You're one of us now, his voice whispered in my mind. The whispers returned, faint and distant, and I knew the truth. I had never left Mount Weather. I never would.